Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, today we're tackling a topic that I think is universally relevant. How to speak English confidently in any situation. And I'm really excited to dig into this with you.
I think it's a really it's a rich topic and one that I think we can all relate to on some level.
For sure. For sure. And I think, whether English is your first language or your second language or your third language or whatever it might be, I think there are times where everyone feels a little bit unsure of themselves, in terms of how they're expressing themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that, when we think about the context of English as a global language, I mean, it's used in so many different contexts, whether it's for business or travel or education or even just, personal interactions online. I mean, the ability to communicate effectively in English has become so important.
It really has. It's become almost essential in many ways. And I think what's interesting is that, you can know a lot of English. You can have a pretty good grasp of the grammar and have a decent vocabulary, but then you get to a situation where you need to actually use it, and suddenly it feels like all that knowledge just evaporates.
Exactly. It's like, you've been studying for the test and then you get into the exam room and your mind goes blank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's like you were saying, it can happen to anyone, but it's particularly common, I think, for people who are learning English as a second language.
Right. And there's this added layer of self-consciousness, I think, that comes with speaking a language that's not your native tongue.
For sure. For sure. And I think that self-consciousness can be really, really debilitating.
It can be. And, one of the things that we often hear from language learners is this fear of making mistakes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. This idea that, if I don't say it perfectly, if I make a grammatical error, or if I mispronounce a word, then people will judge me or they won't take me seriously.
Right. And it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're so worried about making a mistake that you end up either not speaking at all or speaking very hesitantly. And that just reinforces the fear.
Exactly. And it creates this kind of negative feedback loop where, the more you worry about making mistakes, the less you speak, and the less you speak, the less practice you get and the less confident you become.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame because I think one of the most beautiful things about language is its ability to connect people.
Absolutely.
And when we let that fear hold us back, we're really missing out on those opportunities for connection.
We are. And I think it's important to remember that, language is not about perfection. It's about communication.
Exactly.
And, even native speakers make mistakes all the time. We stumble over our words. We use the wrong grammar sometimes, and it doesn't stop us from communicating.
Not at all. Not at all. And I think, when we're learning a language, it's important to shift our focus away from that idea of perfection and towards the idea of progress.
I agree. And I think that that's a really important point is to recognize that learning a language is a journey. It's not a destination.
It's a process. Yeah.
It's a process. And, there will be ups and downs. There will be times when you feel more confident and times when you feel less confident. But the important thing is to keep going.
To keep practicing.
Yeah.
And to celebrate those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. Because every little step forward is a win.
It is. And I think, we were talking about this fear of making mistakes. And I think that that's tied to this kind of broader issue of self-doubt and negative self-talk.
Right. And I think that that's something that a lot of language learners struggle with is this inner critic that's constantly telling them that they're not good enough, that they're not fluent enough, that they're going to make a fool of themselves.
And that voice can be so loud.
It can be deafening.
Yeah. And it can really undermine our confidence.
And it can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy because if we believe that we're not good enough, then we're less likely to put ourselves out there, we're less likely to take risks, and we're less likely to make progress.
It's so true. It's so true. And I think, when we start to notice that negative self-talk, it's important to challenge it.
Absolutely.
To question those thoughts and to replace them with more positive and affirming ones.
Right. And to kind of reframe our thinking about mistakes, instead of seeing them as failures, to see them as opportunities for growth.
Yeah. And to remember that everyone makes mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the learning process.
It is. And it's actually how we learn.
It's how our brains grow.
Exactly. So the more mistakes we make, the more we're learning.
So in a way, making mistakes is a good thing.
It is a sign that you're pushing yourself, that you're stepping outside of your comfort zone.
That's a great way to think about it. So yeah, I think embracing those mistakes and seeing them as opportunities for learning is a really important step in building confidence.
It is. And I think that that's a good segue into talking about some of the more practical strategies that people can use to improve their speaking confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into those.
So one of the things that I always recommend to language learners is to make speaking a habit.
Okay. So how do you do that?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to do it, but the key is to find opportunities to speak English on a regular basis, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
And this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to find a conversation partner every single day.
No, not at all. There are plenty of ways to practice speaking on your own.
Okay, so like what kind of things?
Well, one thing you can do is to simply talk to yourself in English. Describe what you're doing, narrate your day, think out loud in English.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it might feel a little strange at first, but it's a great way to get comfortable with the sound of your own voice speaking English.
Yeah, and to get your brain thinking in English.
Exactly. And another thing you can do is to read aloud in English, find a book or an article that you enjoy, and read it out loud to yourself.
Okay, so you're kind of getting that practice with pronunciation and intonation and things like that.
Exactly. And you can also record yourself speaking and then listen back to it.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it can be a little bit painful at first to listen to your own voice,
Yeah.
but it's a really good way to identify areas where you need to improve.
And to track your progress.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, cool. So those are some good ideas for practicing speaking on your own.
And then, of course, if you can find opportunities to speak with other people, that's even better.
Yeah.
Whether it's a language exchange partner, a tutor, a friend who speaks English, or even just someone you meet online.
Yeah, and I think the key here is to not be afraid to make mistakes. To remember that everyone makes mistakes and that it's part of the learning process.
Right. And the more you speak, the more comfortable you'll become and the less afraid of making mistakes you'll be.
Yeah, that makes sense. So speaking a habit is tip number 1.
That's right.
What's tip number 2?
Tip number 2 is to focus on fluency over accuracy.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So a lot of language learners get really caught up in trying to speak perfectly grammatically correct English.
Right.
And while it's important to learn grammar, of course, it shouldn't be your primary focus when you're speaking.
So it's more important to just get your message across.
Yes, exactly. Because at the end of the day, the goal of speaking is to communicate.
Right, to connect with other people.
Exactly. And if you're constantly stopping to think about grammar rules, you're going to lose that flow of conversation.
Yeah, you're going to sound hesitant and you're going to lose your train of thought.
Right. And it's better to make a few grammar mistakes and still be able to communicate effectively than to speak perfectly grammatically, but be so hesitant and slow that no one can understand you.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a lot of language learners need to hear because we can get so caught up in that perfectionism.
We can. And I think that, it's important to remember that even native speakers don't speak perfectly grammatically correct English all the time.
No, they don't. And I think that's a really reassuring thought.
It is. So don't be afraid to let go of that perfectionism and just focus on getting your message across.
Yeah, and I think, when we're focusing on fluency, we're also focusing on the rhythm and the flow of the language.
Absolutely.
And that can really help to boost our confidence.
It can, because when we're speaking fluently, we're not thinking about the individual words or grammar rules. We're just letting the language flow.
Right, we're in the moment.
Exactly.
Okay, so focus on fluency over accuracy is tip number 2.
That's right.
What's tip number 3?
Tip number 3 is to expand your vocabulary.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward.
It is, but it's also something that a lot of language learners struggle with.
Yeah, because it can feel like such a daunting task.
It can, especially when you think about how many words there are in the English language.
It feels infinite.
It does, but the good news is that you don't need to know every single word in order to communicate effectively.
Okay, so what's a good approach then?
Well, one approach is to focus on learning vocabulary that's relevant to your interests and your goals.
Right, so if you're learning English for business, you're going to want to focus on business vocabulary.
Exactly. And if you're learning English for travel, you're going to want to focus on travel vocabulary.
Makes sense. And how do you actually go about learning new vocabulary?
Well, there are a lot of different methods, but one effective method is to use flashcards.
Okay.
You can create your own flashcards, or you can use a flashcard app.
There are a lot of those out there.
There are, yeah. And the key is to review your flashcards regularly so that the new vocabulary sticks.
repetition is key.
It is. And another good way to learn vocabulary is to read in English.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Choose books or articles that are at your level, and as you read, pay attention to new words and phrases, look them up in a dictionary if you need to, and try to use them in your own speaking and writing.
Okay, so you're kind of immersing yourself in the language.
Exactly. And the more you expose yourself to English, the more new vocabulary you'll pick up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so expand your vocabulary is tip number 3.
Yes.
What's tip number 4?
Tip number 4 is to pay attention to your body language.
Okay, this is interesting.
It is, because body language plays a huge role in communication.
Yeah, we've all heard that like 90% of communication is nonverbal or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. And it's true, when we're speaking, our body language can either support or undermine our message.
So if we're saying one thing, but our body language is saying something else, people are going to pick up on that.
They are,
Yeah.
and they're going to believe our body language over our words.
Wow, so how can we use our body language to project confidence?
Well, first of all, it's important to be aware of your posture.
Okay.
Stand up straight, make eye contact with the person you're speaking to, and use hand gestures to emphasize your points.
And what about things like facial expressions?
Yes, facial expressions are also important. Smile when you're speaking. It will make you seem more approachable and more confident.
And it will probably make you feel more confident too.
Exactly.
Because when we smile, our brains release endorphins, which have mood-boosting effects.
That's right. So smiling is a win-win.
It is. Okay, so pay attention to your body language is tip number 4.
Yes.
What's tip number 5?
Tip number 5 is to listen actively.
Okay, now this might seem a little counterintuitive because we're talking about speaking confidently, but actually listening is a really important part of speaking. It is, because when we listen actively, we're showing the other person that we're interested in what they have to say.
And that we respect them.
Right, and that can help to build rapport and trust.
Exactly. And it also helps us to understand the other person's perspective, which can make our own communication more effective.
Yeah, because if we're not really listening to what the other person is saying, we're not going to be able to respond in a meaningful way.
Right. And when we listen actively, we're also picking up on cues from the other person's body language and tone of voice, which can give us a better understanding of how they're feeling.
That's so true. And I think that active listening is a skill that takes practice.
It does, but it's a skill that's well worth developing.
Absolutely. Okay, so listen actively is tip number 5.
Yes.
So we've covered 5 tips for speaking English confidently, make speaking a habit, focus on fluency over accuracy, expand your vocabulary, pay attention to your body language, and listen actively.
Right.
And I think these are all really great tips that anyone can use, whether you're a beginner or an advanced English learner.
Absolutely. And the most important thing is to just keep practicing.
Yeah, to just keep putting yourself out there and not be afraid to make mistakes.
Right. Because the more you practice, the more confident you'll become.
And the more you'll enjoy speaking English.
Exactly.
So I hope these tips have been helpful, and I encourage everyone to keep practicing and keep learning.
Me too.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in the next deep dive.
Bye.
Bye.